Alright, this is lesson 1.3, and I'd like to tell you about the difference between deductive versus inductive arguments. That means that we're finally coming around to the subject of what makes arguments good versus bad. And we can essentially break that issue down into two separate questions. One is, are the premises true? And I think this is the question that everyone immediately thinks of when asked what makes an argument good. If someone presents you with premises as reasons to believe a conclusion, and you don't think those premises are true, then you're not going to be convinced by the argument. But there's a second question as well, and it's important to see that this is separate from the question of the premises being true. The question is, do the premises support the conclusion? So again, these are separate questions, and you can see that you can have an argument with true premises where the premises don't support the conclusion. I gave you the example of the argument, broccoli is a vegetable, and therefore, for that reason, Africa is a continent. And here I'm going to rewrite that argument in a sort of a stilted way that philosophers sometimes refer to as standard form. It just means you list the premises, and then there's a line, and you have the conclusion. Now we don't have to think about the issue anymore of what the conclusion is and figuring out what the premises are. That's in the past, and we're looking at a list form where we know what the premises are, we know what the conclusion is. And this argument has a true premise. It's true that broccoli is a vegetable, but of course that has nothing to do with Africa being a continent, and so in this argument the premises do not support the conclusion. We can of course also have an argument in which, although the premises are not true, the premises do support the conclusion. So now I want to give you an example like that. Suppose we have the argument that all whales are fish, and secondly that all fish have hair. And then we draw the conclusion that all whales have hair. And I think you immediately notice about this argument that the premises are wildly false. You say to yourself, all whales are fish. That's insane. The most memorable thing from grammar school was that whales are not fish, they're mammals. And the second premise says that all fish have hair, which is of course only true in Dr. Seuss books. So the premises are false, but I want you to think about the relationship between the premises and the conclusion now. And one way of looking at how you can do this is to think in terms of what if the premises were true. So I'm going to ask you to imagine that the premises are true. That's right, imagination plays a big role in thinking about supporting conclusions. Imagine that whales were fish, and imagine that fish did have hair, and then ask yourself this: would the conclusion be true if the premises were true? Now you should be able to see that the conclusion here, that all whales have hair, that would have to be true if the premises were true. Because if whales were fish, if we imagine that whales were fish, never mind what it means to imagine that whales are fish, what are you supposed to picture in your head? Maybe just pretend you've never heard of a whale before, you don't know what that word means, but whatever they are, they're fish. And we add to that that all fish have hair. So all fish have hair. That means those whales that were fish, they've got to have hair too. So that guarantees that all whales have to have hair. So although the premises of this argument are not true, and so for that reason, at the end of the day, it isn't a good argument, you shouldn't be convinced by this argument, nevertheless, the premises have the right kind of relationship to the conclusion. They support the conclusion. And the next thing that we need to look at here is the nature of that support for the conclusion. This argument is an example of what we call a deductive argument. And deductive arguments are distinguished from inductive arguments by the way in which the premises are supposed to support the conclusion. That is to say, one way to distinguish between deductive arguments and inductive arguments is in terms of their success conditions. And when you have a deductive argument, the conditions for success of that deductive argument are, first, you want the premises to be true. And the second requirement for a successful deductive argument is that if the premises were true, then the conclusion would be guaranteed. So the first condition for the success of a deductive argument, that the premises be true, is in general a condition for success in any argument. And the second condition, that if the premises were true, the conclusion will be guaranteed, is a condition that the argument can meet even if the first condition is not met. Even if the premises are false, we could still have an argument like the one about the whales and the fish, where if they were true, then the conclusion would be guaranteed. Now, let me put that second condition to you in another way. We could also say that it's impossible for the premises to be true without the conclusion being true. That is, with the conclusion, while the conclusion is false. Now, an argument that meets this requirement we refer to as a valid deductive argument. So the second condition on a deductive argument for success can now be rephrased as saying that the argument should be valid. And notice that we're defining valid in a special way here. The word valid can be used to mean just generally good, like someone says, I have a valid parking pass, or that's a valid point, Bob, meaning that it's somehow legitimate. But here we have a very specific definition of valid in mind. It means an argument wherein the truth of the premises would guarantee the truth of the conclusion. So we have our two requirements for the success of a deductive argument. It should have true premises, and the argument itself should be valid. It's important to pay attention to how these labels apply. The term valid applies to the entire argument, whereas the question of the premises being true applies to each individual premise. So it doesn't make sense to say that an argument is true or that an argument is false, and it doesn't make sense to say, in this sense of valid, that a statement can be valid or invalid. And I'm going to suggest the following as an intuitive, easy test of whether an argument is valid or not. I call it the imagination test. Step one is that you imagine that the premises of the argument were true. And the next step is that you try to imagine the conclusion being false at the same time while you're still imagining the premises being true. And so if you can imagine the conclusion being false while the premises are true, then the argument is not valid. While if you can't imagine the conclusion being false, well, then we have one of two possibilities. Either the argument is valid, or on the other hand, it's possible that maybe you're just not imagining hard enough, or there's something wrong with your imagination or something. So, for example, let's try applying the imagination test to the argument above, the one about whales. We imagine that all whales are fish, and then we at the same time imagine that all fish have hair. And then we try to imagine at the same time that whales don't have hair. So essentially we're assuming or pretending that whales are fish and that fish have hair, and we're trying to pretend at the same time that whales don't have hair. And if that's what we're trying to imagine, then we can see that we're going to run into trouble, because if we take a look, you could think of this in terms of drawing a picture, right? If the first premise is that whales are fish, then we can think of that in terms of a diagram. So let this circle represent all whales, and then we're saying that all whales are fish, so we could draw a larger circle surrounding that circle. And so this diagram represents the first premise. Now we add into the picture the second premise, that all fish have hair, and we can account for that by drawing an even larger circle around the fish circle, and this represents the things that have hair, the hair-having things. So what I've done is to simply draw a representation of the first two premises, but look what happened. Automatically, it's part of my diagram that whales are contained within the circle of things that have hair. So it is now impossible to add to this picture that whales don't have hair. Once I've accounted for the two premises, it's automatically part of that picture that the whales have hair. And so we can't imagine that all whales are fish and that all fish have hair, and at the same time think that whales don't have hair. So our argument here is a valid deductive argument. Now I want to give you another example of an argument, and I want you to think about whether you think it's a valid deductive argument or not. So here's the argument. Jones and Smith were alone when Smith was stabbed. We know that Jones and Smith were alone, and we know that Smith was stabbed. And the conclusion I draw is that Jones stabbed Smith. And I now want you to use what I was calling the imagination test to think about whether you think this is a valid deductive argument. So go ahead. Assume that the premise is true. Assume that Jones and Smith were alone and Smith was stabbed. And now try to imagine that the conclusion is false, that Jones didn't stab Smith. And if you said, well, I can't imagine that. I can't imagine that they were alone and Smith was stabbed, but Jones didn't stab Smith, then I'm going to say, I think you're not imagining hard enough. Remember, when I say imagination test, I don't mean try to imagine in the sense that someone says, well, I can't imagine that he would have stabbed himself. Because of course you can imagine that. Although you don't necessarily think that's likely, you can imagine that Smith stabbed himself, and so Jones didn't stab Smith. So this is not a valid deductive argument. However, does that mean that this is a bad argument? Certainly not. Remember that I said that there were two kinds of support that arguments could provide for their conclusions. One is the type of support that a valid deductive argument provides for its conclusion. And we see that this argument doesn't contain that kind of support. But There are also inductive arguments, and inductive arguments are also defined in terms of the kind of support that the premises provide for the conclusion. Now in the next video, I want to define an inductive argument, and then we can make a contrast between deductive reasoning and inductive reasoning. So please go to the video on inductive arguments next.